Hello, everyone. So thank you, Keziah, for that great talk. I thought that was wonderful. So I don't know about you, but when I was at school, I studied a whole bunch of different things like maths, geography, what have you. But I never was taught the skill of learning. I was expected maybe to kind of already know it or pick it up as I was going along. And this talk, Learning to Invest in Your Future, is about the why and how of focusing on learning as a specific skill, independent of the things in technology and software or other things that you want to learn. So it's true, I am a maths graduate. Actually, I'm old enough that there wasn't a Department of Computer Science when I was at university. And I'm also old enough to have an 8-year-old son. And when I was talking to him about this talk this week, he said he's really looking forward to when he grows up and can finish school, because then he won't have to learn anything ever again. I did not break the news to him, but that's not how it's going to turn out. Here we are, 5% already through 2020. As at the beginning of every year, it's like a great opportunity to look forward and think about what you're going to achieve that year. And like every year in my career so far, I'm excited by it, but also intimidated, because I know full well that I'm going to spend a lot of this year doing things that I don't really know how to do very well. I'm going to be doing things that I've never done before, and it is genuinely exciting, but also intimidating. So I'd like to tell the story of some people who set out to do something very difficult that had never been done before, starting 58 years ago, 2020, 58. This chap, John F. Kennedy, was President of the United States, and here he is at Rice University announcing that there will be a manned mission to the moon, taking a human to the surface of the moon and bringing them back safely. And it's kind of interesting to, I heard a great story recently about how he came to decide to do that. The fact is that at the time, the USSR was winning the space race. They had put an artificial satellite in space, Sputnik, right? They put a dog in space, because that's a thing. And they put a person in space and brought them back alive, Yuri Gagarin. And they'd done all those things before the US had. NASA was a few years old, and one of the senior figures in NASA at that time was Wernher von Braun, who had been Nazi and moved secretly to America after the Second World War. His suggestion was that the moon mission should be done because it was so difficult, so ambitious, that it basically leveled the playing field between the US and the USSR. There was so much of an advancement in what would need to be done that neither country had a big advantage. So JFK publicly announced by the end of the decade they would have achieved this, and he set a monumental engineering challenge, but also a huge learning challenge. These people were going to be building new things, enormous new things, and huge quantities of new things. They were going to be using new tools, and the new tools, some of the things that they used as their new tools were things that they'd had to build. And they were going to be working in new environments. And I choose to believe that this isn't a Hollywood backlot. This is the new environment of the moon. A lot of things have never been tested in that environment. Well, nothing had ever been tested in that environment, but even in space, everything was rather new. So it's interesting to think about who NASA chose to achieve this. This is the Apollo 11 mission control room, a famous photograph with one female person right in the center. And Jerry Griffin is one of the flight directors of this mission. And he said in an interview, the average age of people in this room is 27 years old. They hired people straight from college based on written applications, no interviews, and put them straight to work, and then they found a place where they could work effectively. A quote from Jerry Griffin: "This task had never been done, but they weren't afraid of it. It was a lack of fear. It wasn't a lack of knowing that it was risky, but they just weren't afraid of it. They didn't have any problem of washing away old experiences that didn't apply anymore." One particular person who I'd like to bring to your attention is this fella. His name's Steve Bales. He's the guidance officer. So his responsibility is understanding and interpreting the output of the computer that's in the lunar module as it's descending to the surface of the moon. And if you've ever seen a movie about the moon landing, I'm sure that the infamous 1202 computer error featured in it. 5 miles from the Earth's surface, the computer started throwing this 1202 error. They all had numeric codes, and it's up to this guy, Steve Bales, to work out what that means and whether they need to abort the mission. Steve Bales didn't know the answer. He had a deputy, Jack Garman, who did know the answer. Steve Bales is 26 at this point in time, Jack Garman 23. And between them, in 15 seconds, they came to the conclusion that the 1202 error was probably all right as long as it didn't happen too often, which is true, which is a debugging technique I still use. 58 years on, it's worked well. So building new things, using new tools in new environments is exactly the daily reality for people who work in software. There's no escaping it. That's like the biggest example I could think of doing that, but for anyone who works with software, this is what happens, what you do every day. The pace of change in software is ludicrous. We're building new things. Every problem is at least subtly different. If it wasn't, we'd just use the thing that solved the pre-existing problem. We're using new tools, languages, frameworks, libraries, editors, shells, operating systems, etc. You can't know them all, right? So at some point, you're going to have to be picking up new ones. And we're working in new environments. AWS this year is going to be 14 years old. And they've been releasing new services at a rate of more than one a month on average since 2006. I don't believe there's a person on Earth who knows all of them, and even in AWS. And that's only one platform. You're always, whenever you push your code somewhere, it's going to be using some platform feature or some framework feature that's new to you. So we're constantly learning as we go. And how do we learn? Like, how do we learn anything, not just software? I talk about playing a musical instrument or learning to swim well or something like that. Any kind of skill you want to learn is learned through practice. Doing a thing over and over until you're good at it. So doing a thing over and over until you're good at it. There's no escaping the fact that if that's what practice is, then at least at the start, you're doing the thing over and over without being good at it. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be missteps. Things aren't always going to work out correctly as you want them to first time. And I almost said it there. It's tempting to think of those things as failures. But if you keep learning as an explicit goal in your mind, then they're not failures. They're great successes. So the thing you need to do in order to learn effectively, accept these mistakes, find or create a safe space where mistakes are okay, where things don't have to work first time. If all you ever do is write code that is pushed straight to production, then that might be very exciting, but it's not a great learning environment. And once you've found or created your safe space and have sort of pre-forgiven yourself for not being perfect, you can even start to enjoy the mistakes and sort of relish them. Here's a still from a video from SpaceX. They're learning how to land rockets on a boat in the middle of the ocean. And they put these videos out of all the things that have gone wrong, and they celebrate it. And I think that's a really wonderfully kind of healthy attitude, because if they already knew how to do it and they were confident it was going to work, and then this happened, it would be not so great a result. But they're explicitly setting out with the goal of learning. So talking about stepping outside of your comfort zone, there's a quote: "If you never push yourself beyond your comfort zone, you will never improve." That quote comes from a person whose office organization skills I greatly admire. His name's Anders Ericsson, and he's an educational psychologist. In the 1980s, he studied the differences in how people practice between high achievers in lots of fields, academic, athletics, music, and other people who don't perform so highly. And he found that obviously there's an amount of practice and a motivation to practice, but also the type of things people who are very high achievers do when they're practicing is qualitatively different to just doing the same thing over and over and hoping to get better at it. And so I think it might be known rather well nowadays, but he coined this phrase, deliberate practice, which describes the process of deconstructing a skill to the point where the individual elements can be practiced in isolation. So let's say, for example, I want to sell socks online. I'm going to build a website to do it. Well, I might need to deconstruct that. I need to learn how to build some front end. I need to learn maybe some server-side and some database or data store technology. And you can deconstruct each of those things further. I might need to know about query planning, HTTP caching, CSS specificity rules. Each of these things can be practiced in isolation, and then when I come and put them back together for Sock Shop Online V2, it's going to be that much better, that much more performant, cheaper to run, and make me more money selling socks. I talk right now about how learning to do something, or skills acquisition as it's sometimes called, is treated and modeled. There are several models of how people acquire new skills. This is one I particularly like, but there's a slide at the end with a link to references with a bunch more. In the case of me learning React, when I remember that React exists and it's a thing that can help me build web pages, then I start to understand it by copying and pasting code, following tutorials, and then I can get to apply that knowledge by using React in my own new websites. After that comes a phase of analysis where I start to understand more about how React works and what its limitations are, and I begin to be able to evaluate it, know where it's strong and weak and how it compares to other things in the same space. And then eventually, if I'm so motivated, I could move towards creating, extending core React or using it in new ways that haven't been thought of before. And all this is, if you think about a skill that you've acquired recently, something you've learned to do, you might recognize some of these phases, but they're blurry, they're very fuzzy. It's not like you suddenly flick between them. And I bring this up to point out that you probably need to be somewhere in this region before you can apply deliberate practice, because you need to be able to decompose the thing into individual components. And this kind of means that at least at the beginning, you're going to be putting in work without really feeling like you're learning, and that can be very damaging to your motivation. If you understand why it's happening, then hopefully you can push through. And once you get to the analyze phase, everything accelerates. You start to be able to ask and answer your own questions. Learning becomes deeper, motivation becomes much more intrinsic. But you do have to accept that it'll take some time before you feel like you're learning when you pick up something new. And it's hard work. It's hard work. Maintaining focus, keeping in mind the thing that you've isolated when you have other things to do, and it's cognitively difficult. Taking breaks is totally recommended in this situation. When you study something for 2 hours and then go for a walk, your brain's still processing, and when you're sleeping, you learn things. You know things better when you wake up than you did when you went to bed. They had a great phrase, which I've already spoiled for you, in the MIT AI lab in the 1960s, where they studied learning in relation to computer programming. They had this idea that as computers became more and more complicated, they would approach the complexity of the human brain, and teaching someone a skill and programming a computer would become basically the same thing. I'm not so sure that's worked out, but they had this phrase, it's hard fun rather than hard work, because you get to the end. I don't know if any of you have ever run a half marathon or a marathon or anything like that, and every step is a bit of a chore, and then you get to the end and you're like, all right, I'm signing up for another one. Because it was really fun. It wasn't fun whilst you were doing it. That's what they mean by hard fun. So I'd like to talk now about some specific techniques that I've used effectively, that other people have told me they've used effectively, and you can read about for effective use of the time that you can find in your safe space to learn. I left it downstairs, but there's a book called Apprenticeship Patterns. Does anybody know this book, Apprenticeship Patterns? Okay, take it as a recommendation from me. It's one of the best books on career development I've ever read. Apprenticeship Patterns, and they say feedback loops are the fundamental way to improve your learning experience. Feedback loops, you have a question, you get an answer to, like, does this work? I'll try it. Does it work? You find out, or you get a helpful error message, hopefully, if it doesn't. Make those as quick as possible. Automate the boring stuff to make those as quick as possible. There's a few reasons why fast feedback loops are especially important. Firstly, you can just do more things, you can try more things. Secondly, and this is often mentioned in the context of test-driven development, where you want very quick running tests. If you don't have a fast feedback loop, you'll get bored, they say. And I find that slightly insulting. Like, if my tests take more than 30 seconds, I'm just going to go to the coffee machine and play pool and stuff. But it can, make it more exciting if things are quicker, for sure. And there's a deeper reason as well. There's a psychologist and Fortran programmer I learned recently called Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He studied intuition, and intuition, in this sense, is accurately making technical decisions without analyzing every step of the process. And he found, like firefighters, were his famous example, deciding when to leave a burning building. They don't do a lot of analysis, they just feel it and they go. And he found intuition is a thing that can enable you to make quick and accurate decisions under certain circumstances. You need a predictable environment, so there's no intuition about lottery numbers. You need practice, the more the better, and you need feedback, the quicker the better. So when you hear someone who's able to very quickly make an accurate assessment of some new technology or some new technique, it's likely that they're using an intuitive way of making that decision. And it's important that they should be able to step back and provide an analytical reason if you ask them to, but this kind of quick decision-making is enabled by fast feedback loops. Secondly, I would recommend you to find and focus on your fundamentals. I'm sure you've already found and will continue to find that there are certain skills, knowledge, technologies that come up again and again when you're coding on different things. It's somewhat the opposite of chasing the shiny new things. For me, I think the fundamental things that have been very helpful to me are understanding the model of the web, clients and servers, requests and responses. Knowing about the JVM and Java, because I've been a Java programmer for a long time, and Clojure, as they mentioned. And knowing about Linux, bash scripting, and also a little bit about the kernel. It's been very widely applicable, but it took me a long time to recognize that those were things that, if practiced in isolation, could bring benefits broadly across lots of projects. I think you should be aware of tools and frameworks that tell you you don't need to know the basics. Like, here's a new client-server toolkit which abstracts HTTP and you don't need to know it. Well, that's a lie, because as soon as it doesn't work like you expect, or as soon as you need to debug anything or extend it in some way, you will need to know it. And you've taken a shortcut, which now you have to backtrack, is going to end up costing more time in the long run. The book Pragmatic Programmer calls these evil wizards, which I think is a great phrase. I'll talk about something now that we're all doing here today. Social learning can be fun. It really can. Finding people to share your learning journey with. Not everyone enjoys the same things. You can't force someone to be your social learning buddy. People learn in different ways. But if you talk about your learning and what you're interested in, you will find people who are interested in going with you. Accountability partners. Book study groups at work or at uni or amongst your friends are great. And if you can't think what's a good book to start with, I would recommend there's a series of books, 7 Things in 7 Weeks. I think the first one was 7 Languages in 7 Weeks, where you spend 7 weeks in a row, each one on a different programming language. And you bootstrapped right to the comparison evaluation kind of stage of learning, because you get a very quick, precise introduction to these things, and you see so many of them in comparison to each other. So book study groups at work, I've got a lot out of those. It's great because you also get to know your colleagues better. You get to know, if you choose a nice book like the 7 Languages one, everyone's a beginner in some bit of it, so it levels the playing field of some people being experts and wanting to sort of dominate the conversation. Excuse me. Group working, pairing, especially with people you don't often pair with on learning projects, is a really, really great way as well. So about today, there are conferences. Thank you for coming to this one. People come to a conference and they pay a lot of attention to who's speaking and what they're speaking about. And it's true. Kevin and the Underland team have put a great program together for you. But There are 250 other people here who you can learn from, as well as us. It's referred to as the hallway track, right? Where people you just bump into downstairs. There's even a specific hour at the end of the day set up for the hallway track. Like me, you may be rather nervous of striking up new conversations with strangers. And I can give you an icebreaker that someone gave to me, which is, what's an interesting thing that you've learned recently? You can have that for free. Please use it. I like it because if someone asks me that, I don't have to talk about myself. So the kind of shyness aspect of my personality doesn't sort of stop me from talking because, I learned about a particular type of pigeon, or I learned something new about how a browser works. Meetups, people think meetups may be like mini conferences, but there's a couple of big differences. You can meet the same people over and over, and you might find learning buddies there. But I've run a couple of meetups in Bristol for the last few years. And I'll tell you now, if anyone wants to come to Bristol and speak at a meetup, I will be in your debt. You will be my hero and my best friend straight away, because the challenge of getting new speakers to meetups is constant. So if you're interested in learning something, why not offer to present about it at a meetup? The organizers will thank you a lot. And Douglas Adams, in one of his Dirk Gently books, there's a section where they're talking about education. And he says, if you really want to understand something, the best way is to try and explain it to someone else. That forces you to sort it out in your own mind. So this is a selfish and unselfish way of learning. It's unselfish because you're sharing knowledge, bringing people up with you, but it's kind of selfish because you're putting yourself on the line and you have to learn something yourself. And you'll become the expert in the room on that thing, whether you want to or not, once you've committed to doing it. It's also fun. Whilst we're on the topic of conferences and the hallway track, I wonder how many of you know about this thing that's called the Pac-Man rule? A small handful. Okay, I'll introduce it. On the left, we can practice it later, is a group of 6 people chatting in a closed circle, and the poor yellow person can't get into the conversation. They're very sad about it. On the right, the 6 people have remembered for the Pac-Man rule to step back and leave a space for new people to join the conversation. What have you been learning about recently? So if you get a chance to practice that later, it would be really great to see more and more people talking. Some more learning. Keep a learning diary. I'm not sure if you can read it from there. That's my learning diary on top of my what I did each day diary. They're separate things. It's an old one from when I worked at Oracle, and I hope there's no secrets there. Probably fine. It's easy to forget how far you've come. I read my learning diaries going back for several years, and I'm like, oh, crikey, I remember there was a time when I didn't know that, and now it's like, it's part of something I do every day without thinking about it. It's very easy. Everything you learn is your new status quo straight away. But also, reviewing your learning diary, in 20 minutes or so, you can read through a year's worth of learning, and you'll create connections between things that weren't obvious at the time. And it's a way that you can find your fundamentals and identify those things that really are like critical to your experience. It's like a very slow form of feedback loop. Everyone learns differently. This is a well-established thing. Some people like reading, some listening. I struggle really hard learning things from videos. I'm a reader. Podcasts, I find it difficult to focus on. But everyone's different. There's nothing wrong with any particular style. Identify your style and make time. Whilst you're having your breakfast, listen to a podcast. Or whilst you're waiting for your colleagues to arrive in the morning, read a blog. It's a great thing to make a habit of. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, and it's additive. It builds up and up over time. And you end up with a very broad set of knowledge. So, in summary, create your safe space and embrace missteps. Think about deliberate practice. Think about practicing things in isolation. Create fast feedback loops. Like I mentioned, I'm a Java programmer. Java projects can be a pain in the ass to set up. It can take like 10 minutes to get a Hello World working, depending on how you configure it. So I keep a pre-canned Hello World project open in an IDE, minimized, and then when I have something I want to try, I can just unminimize it, try the thing, Does it work or not? Maybe just delete that code back to a hello world and it's out of the way. Get used to the JavaScript console in the browser. Learn keyboard shortcuts for your favorite editor. Just get used to being able to do things quickly and get feedback quickly on your thoughts. Find your fundamentals, as I mentioned. Socializing your learning, it's super, super powerful. Keep yourself a Today I Learned diary and find your learning style and engage in it. We still have, like I showed at the beginning, 95% of 2020 left. So it's not too late. I don't think it's too late for New Year's resolution. Try setting some learning goals for 2020 and be explicit about the fact that they're for learning and not for any particular technology. So you have got this. You've got this. Thank you very much for listening. And here's where you can go to find out more about what I said. Thank you.